I remember the exact weight of the silence before everything changed. It pressed against my chest like a held breath, heavy and expectant, filling the space between us on my worn couch where we had sat countless times before. But this time felt different. This time, the air itself seemed to vibrate with something unspoken, something dangerous. Silas had been staring at the floor for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than minutes. His fingers worried the hem of his sweater, a nervous habit I had come to recognize over the 3 years we had known each other. The lamplight caught the copper threads in his dark hair, and I found myself memorizing the way shadows fell across his profile. I had been doing that more often lately, cataloging details I had no right to notice. The television murmured something inconsequential in the background. We had been watching a movie, though neither of us could have said what it was about. The real drama was happening in the spaces between our words, in the careful distance we maintained on opposite ends of the couch, in the way we both pretended not to notice when our eyes met and lingered a heartbeat too long. I had been carrying something heavy for months, maybe longer. It lived in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow, growing heavier each time Silas laughed at something I said, each time he fell asleep during our study sessions with his head tilted toward me, each time he looked at me like I was something worth seeing. I told myself it was friendship. I told myself it was normal to feel protective, to want to make him smile, to think about him when he wasn't there. But friends don't usually ache the way I ached. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Silas shifted, and I caught a glimpse of his face. His expression was careful, guarded, but there was something else there, something that made my pulse quicken and my mouth go dry. I don't know what made me say it. Maybe it was the way he kept not quite looking at me, or the way his breathing had changed, shallow and careful. Maybe it was the weight of all the things we had never said pressing down until I couldn't hold them anymore. Fine, we could try once. The words fell out of me like stones, heavy and irreversible. My voice cracked on the last word, betraying me completely. I sounded like I was 13 again, uncertain and raw. Silas went very still. His eyes lifted to mine, and I saw something flicker there. Surprise, maybe, or recognition, or fear. I couldn't tell which, and that terrified me more than anything. He nodded, just once, a movement so small I might have imagined it. But I didn't imagine the way he leaned forward slightly, closing some of the careful distance between us. I didn't imagine the way his hand moved, trembling, to rest on the couch cushion halfway between us. I had kissed people before. Girls, mostly in fumbling encounters that felt more like performances than anything real. I thought I knew what kissing was supposed to feel like, supposed to mean, but when Silas leaned closer and I met him in the middle, when our lips touched for the first time, I realized I had never really kissed anyone at all. It was hesitant, uncertain, lasting only a few seconds before we broke apart. But in those seconds, something fundamental shifted. The careful architecture of our friendship, built on unspoken boundaries and safe distances, cracked down the middle. I laughed afterward, a sound that came out too loud and too bright. I was trying to fill the silence, trying to make it normal again, try to pretend my hands weren't shaking. There, I said, as if I had just completed some mundane task. Once. But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. Once was never going to be enough. I could feel it in the way my chest still felt tight, in the way Silas was looking at me with those dark, serious eyes, in the way the space between us no longer felt safe. When Silas turned away, ostensibly to focus on the forgotten movie, I found myself watching him. The line of his neck, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the careful way he held himself. I was already breaking my own rule, already wanting more than the once I had offered. The movie played on, but I wasn't watching it anymore. I was watching Silas, and thinking about the way his lips had felt against mine, soft and warm and real. I was thinking about how wrong I had been about everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted, about who I was supposed to be. The word once echoed in my head, but it already felt hollow, meaningless. A placeholder for something I wasn't brave enough to name yet. Because the truth was sitting there between us now, unavoidable and terrifying. This wasn't going to be once. This was going to be the beginning of something I couldn't undo, something that would change everything about who we were to each other. I stole another glance at Silas and caught him looking back. We both looked away quickly, but not before I saw it. The same recognition I was feeling, the same impossible want, the same knowledge that once had already become a lie the moment we had crossed that line. The silence that followed was different from the one that had come before. This one was full of possibilities and dangers, of all the things we still hadn't said and all the reasons we shouldn't say them. It was the silence of people standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, trying to decide whether to step forward or turn back. But some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. Some words, once spoken, cannot be taken back. And some kisses, no matter how brief or hesitant, change everything that comes after. I sat there in that loaded silence, knowing that tomorrow would come with its own challenges, its own questions, its own impossible choices. But for now, there was just this moment, this new and fragile thing between us, this once that had already become something more. I need to tell you about who we were before that kiss rewrote everything. Before once became a word that haunted us both. I was 23 then, a political science major who had always prided myself on understanding systems, on predicting outcomes, on knowing how things worked. I studied governance and policy with the same methodical approach I applied to everything else in my life. There was comfort in frameworks and being able to categorize and analyze. I dated casually, never letting anyone get too close, never staying long enough for complications to arise. Sarah for a few weeks in the fall. Emma briefly over winter break. Nothing serious, nothing that required me to examine too closely what I actually wanted. I had a reputation among our friends for being steady, reliable, the one who could be counted on to stay calm in a crisis, to offer practical solutions, to keep his head when everyone else was losing theirs. I wore that identity like armor, and it served me well. People trusted me because I seemed to have my life figured out. But around Silas, that carefully constructed steadiness began to crack. Silas was 22, an art student who lived in a converted studio apartment above a used bookstore downtown. The space was small, maybe 400 square feet, but he had transformed it into something magical. His drawings covered every available wall surface, taped up in overlapping layers that created a kind of visual diary of his thoughts. Charcoal sketches of hands and faces, watercolor landscapes that seemed to shift in the changing light, ink studies of architectural details he had noticed on his walks around the city. He never showed his work to anyone, not really. I only saw it because I spent so much time there, studying together, watching movies, existing in comfortable silence. But I noticed how his eyes would dart to my face whenever I looked at a new drawing, searching for some reaction he never asked for directly. His apartment smelled like coffee and paper and something indefinably him. The walls were thin enough that you could hear the couple upstairs arguing about whose turn it was to do dishes, the sound of footsteps on the old wooden floors, the distant hum of traffic on the street below. There was an intimacy to the space that felt different from anywhere else we spent time. Here, away from campus and friends and the expectations of who we were supposed to be, we could just exist. Silas was quieter than me, more careful with his words. He had a way of listening that made you feel like whatever you were saying mattered, really mattered. His dark hair was always slightly messy, like he had been running his hands through it while he worked, and he had this habit of chewing on the end of his pencil when he was thinking. I found myself watching for these small details, collecting them without meaning to. Our friendship had developed slowly, naturally. We met in a philosophy elective during my sophomore year, his junior year. I was drawn to his thoughtfulness, the way he would sit quietly in class discussions until he had something genuinely insightful to contribute. After class, we started walking in the same direction, discovering we both lived off campus. Those walks became coffee, coffee became study sessions became movie nights that stretched until dawn. There was something easy about being with Silas. We could sit in comfortable silence for hours, each doing our own work, but sharing the space. We could talk about anything or nothing. He would sketch while I read, occasionally showing me something he was working on, his fingers careful not to smudge the charcoal as he held the paper up to the light. I told myself it was just friendship, really good friendship, the kind that comes along rarely, if ever. I told myself that everyone has that one friend who feels different, more important somehow. I told myself that the way I looked forward to seeing him, the way his smile could shift my entire day, the way I found excuses to spend time in his small apartment, was normal. But normal friends don't usually memorize the exact shade of each other's eyes. Normal friends don't feel their pulse quicken when hands accidentally brush while reaching for the same book. Normal friends don't lie awake at night, replaying conversations, analyzing the spaces between words for hidden meanings. I have been carrying these feelings for months without naming them, like holding my breath underwater. They lived in the careful distance I maintained on his couch, in a way I never let our study sessions run too late, in the jokes I made whenever the silences between us grew too comfortable, too loaded with possibility. Silas never pushed. He seemed to understand the boundaries I needed, even when I didn't fully understand them myself. He would make space for my restlessness, my need to fill quiet moments with words, my tendency to deflect with humor when things felt too real. But I caught him watching sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking. There was something in his expression during those moments, something careful and hopeful and terrified all at once. Like he was seeing something in me that I wasn't ready to see in myself. Our friendship existed in this delicate balance, built on unspoken agreements and careful navigation around the things we couldn't say. We both knew there were territories we didn't explore, questions we didn't ask, closeness we didn't allow. Until that night, when once cracked, everything opened, and all the careful distance in the world couldn't protect us from what we had always been moving toward. The morning after changed everything and nothing at all. I woke up in my own bed, alone, with the taste of that kiss still ghosting across my lips and the weight of what we had done settling into my chest like lead. The sunlight streaming through my windows felt too bright, too normal for a world that had shifted fundamentally the night before. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it had been a dream. But I could still feel the echo of Silas's mouth against mine, soft and uncertain and real. I did what I always did when faced with something I couldn't categorize or control. I built walls. I constructed a careful performance of normalcy, practiced casual jokes in my head, rehearsed explanations that would make it all seem insignificant. Just two friends who had gotten carried away in a moment. Nothing more than curiosity satisfied, a line crossed, and immediately stepped back from. When I showed up at campus that morning, I was armed with deflection and determined cheerfulness. I found Silas in the library, hunched over a sketchbook in our usual corner table. He looked up when I approached, and I saw something flicker across his face before he schooled his expression into careful neutrality. "Hey," I said, sliding into the chair across from him with studied casualness. "Working on anything interesting?" He glanced down at his sketch, then closed the book. "Just some gesture studies," he said quietly. I launched into a story about my morning, something inconsequential about my roommate and burnt coffee and a professor who had moved our exam. I kept talking, filling the space between us with words, watching as Silas nodded and made appropriate responses. But his eyes kept searching my face, looking for something I wasn't ready to give him. We fell into our familiar rhythm, or at least I pretended we did. Study sessions, casual conversations, the comfortable routine we had built over months. I told jokes. I teased him about his messy handwriting. I asked about his classes, his latest drawing project, anything that would keep us safely in the territory of friendship. But underneath the performance, everything felt different. I caught myself watching his hands as he wrote notes, remembering how they had trembled slightly before our kiss. I found my gaze lingering on his mouth when he spoke, then forcing myself to look away. The casual touches that had always been part of our friendship, shoulders bumping as we walked, brief contact when passing books or papers, now felt charged with electricity. Silas seemed to understand what I was doing. He played along, matching my casual tone, responding to my jokes with small smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes. But I could feel him watching me, cataloging the careful distance I was maintaining, noting the way I deflected whenever our conversation veered toward anything too personal or meaningful. The day passed in this elaborate dance of pretending. We were both excellent actors, it turned out. Anyone watching us would have seen exactly what they expected to see. Two close friends, comfortable in each other's company, nothing unusual or complicated about the dynamic between us. But as evening approached, as we gathered our books and prepared to part ways, something shifted. The performance became harder to maintain. The silences between words stretched longer, became more loaded. When Silas looked at me, I saw the same recognition I was trying so hard to suppress. I should go, I said, though neither of us had mentioned evening plans. Early class tomorrow. Silas nodded, but he didn't move to pack up his things. Instead, he sat there looking at me with those dark, serious eyes, and I felt the careful walls I had built all day beginning to crack. Nolan, he said quietly, and just the way he said my name made my chest tighten. I stood up quickly, gathering my books. See you tomorrow, I said, not quite meeting his eyes. But as I walked away, I could feel him watching me go. And I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that tomorrow would come with its own challenges, its own impossible choices. That night, I sat in my room trying to focus on reading assignments, but my mind kept drifting back to the morning in the library, to the way Silas had looked at me, patient and careful and waiting, to the questions he hadn't asked but that hung in the air between us anyway. I told myself I was protecting our friendship. I told myself that what had happened was an aberration, a moment of weakness that we could both move past if we just pretended hard enough. I told myself that the performance of normalcy would eventually become real again. But lying in bed that night, staring at the same ceiling I had studied that morning, I knew I was lying to myself. Because I couldn't stop thinking about that kiss, about the way it had felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff all at once, about the way Silas had looked at me afterward, like he was seeing something in me that I was terrified to acknowledge. And underneath all my careful denial, underneath all my desperate attempts to rebuild the safe distance between us, was a truth I wasn't ready to face. I wanted to see him again. Not tomorrow in the library with books and careful conversation and the performance of friendship. I wanted to see him tonight, in his small apartment with the drawings on the walls and the intimate lighting and the silence that had always felt too comfortable, too loaded with possibility. I wanted to cross that line again and again and again. The realization sat in my chest like a weight, terrifying and undeniable. Because once was supposed to have been enough. Once was supposed to have satisfied whatever curiosity had driven us to that moment. But as I lay there in the dark, I knew that once had never been the end of anything. It had been the beginning. I lasted 3 days before I found myself standing outside Silas's apartment again. 3 days of pretending I could go back to who I had been before that kiss. 3 days of sitting through classes and conversations and meals, all while feeling like I was watching my life from outside my own body. 3 days of lying awake at night, replaying every moment of that evening until the memory felt worn smooth from handling. I had tried everything I could think of to distract myself. I went to a party with my roommate, stood in a crowded kitchen nursing a beer while people laughed and flirted around me, feeling like I was speaking a language I had suddenly forgotten. I called Emma, the girl I had dated briefly over winter break, and made awkward small talk until she asked if everything was okay, and I made excuses to hang up. I threw myself into studying with an intensity that would have impressed my professors, reading the same pages over and over without absorbing a single word. Nothing worked. Everything felt hollow, performative, like I was going through the motions of being myself without actually inhabiting my own life. By the third evening, I couldn't stand it anymore. I found myself walking across campus without having consciously decided to do so, my feet carrying me along familiar paths toward the used bookstore, toward the narrow staircase that led to Silas's door. The October air was sharp against my face, carrying the smell of burning leaves and the promise of winter. I stood outside his building for a long time, hands shoved deep in my jacket pockets, looking up at the warm light spilling from his windows. I could see shadows moving behind the thin curtains, and I knew he was up there, probably working on another drawing, probably wondering if I would ever acknowledge what had happened between us. Part of me wanted to turn around, to go home and continue the elaborate performance of pretending none of this mattered. But a larger part of me, a part that was growing stronger with each passing hour, needed to see him again. Needed to understand what this thing was that had taken root in my chest and refused to be ignored. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling both inevitable and terrifying. When I reached his door, I stood there for another long moment, my hand raised a knock, frozen between wanting and fear. Before I could lose my nerve, I knocked. The sounds from inside his apartment stopped. Footsteps approached the door, paused. I could picture him on the other side, probably looking through the peephole, probably as surprised to see me as I was to be standing there. The door opened, and there he was, Silas in an old sweater and jeans, his hair messy from running his hands through it, a smudge of charcoal on his left temple. He looked at me with those dark eyes, and I saw surprise there, and something that might have been relief. "Nolan," he said quietly. I opened my mouth to speak, to offer some casual explanation for why I was there, but no words came. Instead, we stood there looking at each other, and I felt all the careful distance I had been maintaining for 3 days collapse in an instant. "Don't look at me like that," I said finally, though my voice came out rougher than I intended. "Like what?" he asked, like he knew I would come back. But he had known, I realized. I could see it in his face, in the way he stepped aside to let me in without question, in the way he didn't seem surprised at all. He had been waiting. I stepped into his apartment, and the familiar smell of coffee and paper and something indefinably him hit me, like a physical force. The drawings on the walls seemed different somehow, more alive, more present. Or maybe I was different. Maybe I was finally seeing clearly. I started then stopped. I couldn't sleep. I tried again. Too much noise at my place. We both knew it was a lie. My apartment was quieter than his, more insulated from the sounds of the city. But Silas didn't call me on it. He just nodded and closed the door behind me. "Do you want coffee?" he asked. I nodded, though I didn't really want coffee. I wanted an excuse to stay, to be in this space with him, to figure out what was happening to me. He moved around his small kitchen, and I watched his hands as he measured coffee grounds, as he filled the kettle with water. The same hands that had trembled before our first kiss. The same hands that I'd been thinking about for 3 days straight. When he handed me the mug, our fingers brushed, and I felt that same electric shock I had been trying to convince myself I had imagined. Silas felt it too. I could tell by the way he pulled his hand back just a little too quickly. We sat on his couch, the same couch where everything had changed 3 nights ago, maintaining that careful distance again. But the air between us felt different now. Charged, full of possibility and danger. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I said finally, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Silas went very still. "About what?" "You know what?" He set his coffee mug down on the small table beside the couch and turned to face me. The movement felt significant, like a door opening. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was expectant, waiting, full of all the things we hadn't said and all the things we were finally ready to stop avoiding. When Silas leaned forward slightly, I didn't pull away. When I reached for him, he met me halfway. And when our lips touched for the second time, it was different from the first. Hungrier, more certain, like we had both stopped pretending this was something we could ignore. This time, when we broke apart, neither of us laughed. Neither of us made jokes or tried to fill the silence with explanations. We just sat there, breathing hard, looking at each other with something that felt like recognition. The word once had never felt more meaningless. After that second kiss, something fundamental shifted between us. The careful pretense we had both been maintaining crumbled, leaving us in uncharted territory where the old rules no longer applied. I started coming to Silas's apartment every night. At first, I still arrived with excuses. Stories about my roommate bringing people over, complaints about construction noise from the building next door, vague mentions of needing a quiet place to study. Silas never questioned these explanations, though we both knew they were becoming increasingly transparent. He would simply step aside to let me in, make coffee or tea, and we would settle into the familiar rhythm of existing in the same space. But everything was different now. The air between us hummed with tension, with possibility, with the weight of things we weren't quite ready to name. Every casual touch, every shared glance, every moment of comfortable silence felt loaded with meaning. During the day, I maintained my usual routines. Classes, study groups, conversations with friends who had no idea that my entire understanding of myself was quietly unraveling. I went through the motions of being the person I had always been, steady and reliable and uncomplicated. But underneath the performance, I felt like I was holding my breath, counting the hours until I could return to that small apartment above the bookstore. The nights began to follow a pattern. I would arrive with my transparent excuses. Silas would welcome me in without question, and we would spend the evening in a careful dance of almost intimacy. We would sit closer together on the couch than we ever had before. Our conversations would drift into more personal territory, touching on dreams and fears and the kinds of vulnerabilities we had never shared with anyone else. And then, inevitably, there would be a moment when the space between us became too small to ignore. A brush of fingers when reaching for the same book, a shared laugh that lingered too long, a silence that stretched until it became unbearable. The kisses that followed were different each time, sometimes hesitant, as if we were both still surprised to find ourselves there. Sometimes urgent, hungry, full of a desperation that frightened us both. But always deliberate now, chosen rather than accidental. I told myself I was still in control, still capable of walking away at any time. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. I wasn't experimenting anymore. I wasn't satisfying idle curiosity or crossing lines just to see what would happen. I was falling. 3 weeks into this new routine, Silas finally asked the question I had been dreading. We were sitting on his couch after another evening of careful conversation and inevitable kissing. My shirt was wrinkled, my hair messed from his fingers running through it, and the taste of him still lingered on my lips. The lamplight cast warm shadows across his face, and I found myself memorizing the exact shade of his eyes in that light. "Why do you keep coming back?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air between us, simple and devastating. I felt my chest tighten, felt all the careful explanations I had been constructing collapse under the weight of honesty he was asking for. "I don't know," I said, though that wasn't entirely true. Silas looked at me steadily, waiting. He had always been good at waiting, at giving me space to find my words. But this time, the silence felt different. This time, it felt like he wouldn't accept deflection or half-truths. I thought once would be enough. I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The words came out cracked and raw, carrying more truth than I had intended to reveal. Because that was the heart of it, wasn't it? I had convinced myself that one kiss would satisfy whatever strange curiosity had been building between us. That crossing that line once would somehow make it easier to step back from it. But it isn't, I continued, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. Silas's expression softened, and I saw something shift in his eyes. Relief, maybe, or recognition of something he had been seeing in me for weeks that I hadn't been ready to acknowledge. "So what do you want?" he asked, and his voice was gentler now, careful in a way that made my throat tighten. I looked at him sitting there in the lamplight, patient and beautiful and real, and felt something inside my chest crack open. All the careful walls I had built, all the categories I had used to organize my life, all the certainty I had carried about who I was and what I wanted crumbled under the weight of that simple question. "You," I said, the word falling out of me like a confession. Even if I don't know how to say it yet. The silence that followed was different from any we had shared before. It wasn't loaded with possibility or tension or unspoken questions. It was the silence of truth finally spoken, of secrets finally shared, of two people standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable and choosing to step forward together. Silas reached for me then, his hand cupping my face with a tenderness that made my chest ache. When he kissed me this time, it felt like an answer to a question I had been afraid to ask. It felt like coming home to a place I hadn't known I was looking for. When we broke apart, I rested my forehead against his and tried to catch my breath. The word once seemed to echo in the space between us, but it felt hollow now, meaningless. A relic from a time when I'd still believed I could control this, could limit it, could walk away unchanged. "I want more," Silas whispered against my lips, and I felt the last of my careful control slip away. More. The words settled into my chest like a key turning in a lock, opening doors I hadn't even known were there. More nights like this. More kisses that tasted like truth. More of whatever this was becoming between us. The once was over. The truth had finally slipped through all my carefully constructed defenses, and there was no taking it back now. I didn't want to take it back. The night after Silas whispered more against my lips, I knew I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I spent the entire day carrying the weight of that word in my chest, feeling it settle into spaces I hadn't known existed. More. Such a simple concept, but it reframed everything that had come before and everything that would come after. It meant admitting that this wasn't temporary, wasn't experimental, wasn't something I could categorize and file away as a phase or a mistake. It meant choosing. I went through my classes that day like a sleepwalker, taking notes I wouldn't remember, participating in discussions that felt like they were happening underwater. My friends asked if I was feeling okay, if I was coming down with something. I told them I was just tired, just stressed about midterms, just distracted by assignment deadlines. All eyes that felt increasingly hollow in my mouth. The truth was that I was terrified. Terrified of what I was feeling, of what it meant about who I was, of what it would mean for everything I thought I understood about my life. But underneath the fear was something else, something that had been growing stronger each night I spent in Silas's apartment. Certainty. I was certain that I wanted to see him again. Certain that the careful distance I had spent months maintaining was more exhausting than the vulnerability of closeness. Certain that the word once had become not just meaningless, but actively painful, a reminder of how badly I had underestimated what was happening between us. When evening came, I didn't manufacture excuses or construct elaborate justifications for why I needed to see him. I didn't practice casual conversation starters or rehearse explanations for my presence. Instead, I walked across campus with a kind of determined calm I hadn't felt in weeks. The October night was crisp and clear, the kind of evening that made the city feel electric with possibility. Street lights cast long shadows across the sidewalks, and I could smell wood smoke from someone's fireplace, the scent mixing with the familiar urban symphony of distant traffic and muffled conversations. When I reached Silas's building, I didn't hesitate on the sidewalk this time. I climbed the narrow stairs 2 at a time, my heart beating steadily, but not frantically. I felt strangely calm, like I was finally moving in the right direction after weeks of fighting against invisible currents. I knocked on his door with steady knuckles, and when he opened it, I met his eyes directly. He stood there in the doorway wearing an old gray sweater and jeans that had paint stains on one knee. His hair was messy in that way that meant he had been working, probably hunched over his drawing table for hours. There was a question in his expression, but also something that looked like relief. "Nolan," he said softly. "I don't want once," I said before he could say anything else, before I could lose my nerve or retreat into comfortable deflection. The words hung in the air between us, simple and direct and completely honest. I watched as something shifted in Silas's face, as understanding and surprise, and something that might have been joy flickered across his features. "I want more," I continued, borrowing his word from the night before, letting it carry all the weight I had been afraid to acknowledge. Silas stepped back to let me in, but he didn't look away from my face. There was an intensity in his gaze that I had never seen before, like he was seeing me clearly for the first time. I crossed the threshold into his apartment, and it felt different somehow. Not just familiar now, but like coming home to a place I had been searching for without knowing it. The drawings on the walls seemed more vivid, the warm lamplight more welcoming, the small space more intimate than ever before. Silas closed the door behind me, and we stood there looking at each other in the soft lighting of his living room. But this time, the silence between us wasn't loaded with uncertainty or careful navigation around unspoken boundaries. This time, It felt like the pause before a decision that had already been made. I reached for him first, my hand finding the soft fabric of his sweater, pulling him closer. When he came willingly, eagerly, I felt something inside my chest expand and settle at the same time. The kiss that followed was different from all the others that had come before it. It wasn't hesitant or experimental or careful. It wasn't hidden behind laughter or followed by nervous jokes. It wasn't the product of moment weakness or curiosity or accident. It was deliberate, chosen, full of certainty that had taken me weeks to find and seconds to embrace. When we broke apart, I stayed close, my forehead resting against his, my hand still fisted in his sweater. I could feel his breath against my skin, could smell the familiar scent of charcoal and coffee and something uniquely him. I thought I knew what I wanted. I said quietly, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was admitting. I thought I had it all figured out. Silas's hands came up to frame my face, his thumbs brushing across my cheekbones in a gesture so tender it made my chest ache. "And now?" he asked. "Now I know I was wrong about everything," I said. "About who I am, about what I want, about what's possible." He smiled then, the first truly unguarded smile I'd seen from him in weeks. It transformed his entire face, made him look younger and older at the same time, more beautiful than I had ever noticed and more real than anything else in my carefully constructed world. We kissed again, and this time it felt like a promise rather than a question, like the beginning of something rather than the continuation of uncertainty, like choosing each other deliberately, completely, without reservation or limitation. The word once had finally been erased completely, replaced by something infinitely more honest and infinitely more frightening. Always. I had thought once would be enough to satisfy whatever strange pull I felt towards Silas. But standing there in his apartment, holding him close and tasting the promise of more on his lips, I understood that once had never been the point. The point was this moment, this choice, this deliberate step towards something I couldn't name, but desperately wanted to discover. The choice was made. Weeks have passed since that night, when I stopped pretending and chose more. Weeks of learning what it means to let someone see you completely, to exist without the careful walls I had spent years constructing around myself. Silas still lives in the same small apartment above the bookstore, but everything about the space feels different now. The drawings on the walls seem more alive somehow, more present, as if they too understand that something fundamental has shifted. There are new sketches mixed among the old ones now, quick studies of hands and profiles and moments of quiet intimacy that I recognize as us. He draws while I read, capturing fragments of our evenings together with the same careful attention he once reserved for architectural details and landscape studies. I come here every night now, but not with excuses anymore. I come because this is where I belong, because the small space between his couch and kitchen table has become the most honest place I know. I come because when Silas looks up from his drawing pad and smiles at me, something in my chest settles into place like a key finding its lock. The routine we have developed feels both new and ancient, like we're discovering something that was always meant to exist between us. I arrive around 7, usually carrying takeout from the Thai place down the street or groceries for the simple meals we prepare together in his tiny kitchen. We eat sitting close together on his couch, our knees touching, sharing food and conversation in comfortable silences that no longer feel loaded with unspoken questions. Afterward, we settle into our respective work. I spread my political science textbooks across his coffee table while he returns to his drawing pad, and we exist in the same space with an ease that feels miraculous after all those months of careful distance. Sometimes he shows me what he is working on, holding up a sketch with paint-stained fingers and watching my face for reaction. Sometimes I read passages aloud from my assignments, and he listens with the kind of attention that makes even the driest policy analysis feel important. But it is the small moments that have taught me the most about who we are becoming together. The way Silas reaches for my hand without looking away from his drawing. The way he curls against me when we watch movies, his head finding the space between my shoulder and neck like it was designed to fit there. The way he makes coffee for both of us in the morning, even though I'm usually rushing to get to my early classes and barely have time to drink it. He still fumbles for words sometimes, still hides behind half-jokes when conversations venture into territory that feels too vast or overwhelming. But his actions speak more clearly than language ever could. His hand finding mine in the dark when we sleep. His body curving closer to mine throughout the night, seeking warmth and contact even in unconsciousness. The way he looks at me when he thinks I am not paying attention, with an expression so open and unguarded it makes my breath catch. I have learned that love is not the dramatic revelation I always expected it to be. It is not a lightning strike or a moment of sudden clarity that changes everything at once. Instead, it is a slow recognition, a gradual understanding that builds layer by layer, until one day you realize that the person sitting across from you sketching in lamplight has become the most essential part of your world. There are still moments when the magnitude of what has changed between us feels overwhelming. Times when I catch sight of myself in his bathroom mirror and am surprised by the person looking back, someone softer and more open than the carefully controlled version of myself I maintained for so long. Times when we were walking across campus together, and I realized that other people can probably see it in the way we move together, in the careful distance we no longer maintain, in the small smiles we share over private jokes. But those moments of uncertainty are becoming rarer, replaced by a growing sense of rightness that feels both surprising and inevitable. This is who I am when I stop performing, when I stop trying to fit myself into categories that were always too small to contain the fullness of what I feel. This is who we are together when we stop pretending that once was ever going to be enough. The phrase "we can try" once feels like it belongs to a different lifetime now, spoken by a different version of myself who believed that feelings could be controlled and limited and safely contained. That person seems both familiar and foreign to me now, like looking at photographs of yourself from childhood and recognizing the features while marveling at how much has changed. Sometimes, late at night, when Silas is asleep beside me, and I am listening to the sounds of the city filtering through his thin walls, I think about that first kiss and how terrified I was of what it might mean. I think about all the energy I spent trying to maintain distance, trying to categorize and control something that was always going to be bigger than my ability to contain it. But mostly I think about how simple it feels now, how natural it is to wake up in his bed, to share his coffee, to exist in his space like I have always belonged there. How easy it is to say, "I love you," when the words come naturally, without force or fear or the weight of expectations I can no longer remember caring about. The word once has disappeared entirely from our vocabulary, replaced by always and again and more. Replaced by the quiet certainty that some things, once begun, are meant to continue indefinitely. Replaced by the understanding that the best parts of love are not the dramatic moments of choosing, but the ordinary evenings that follow, when choice becomes simply the way you live.